Hope that you are having a great day. And in this mini lecture, we begin to make the transition away from introductory concepts and into our first real topic of substance, the ancient, or some would call classical, political theory. Chapter 2 of your textbook places almost an exclusive emphasis on the ancient Greeks. When I took political theory, we also talked quite a bit about the Roman contribution, which was more in the arena of law and constitutionalism and constitutions, and less on political theories. But when I took political theory, and obviously that was a long time ago, I took a political theory formally for the first time in college. I believe it was in 1979. But I was kind of disappointed that the course just began really with Socrates. And what I like about chapter 2 is that even though it's only a very brief discussion of the Ionians, and I'm going to add a lot to your textbook just because I want to give you an idea for why I think they're so important. But it also talks about the sophists. And one of the things that confused me about Socrates and Plato, who really detested the sophists, the assumption of the professor was we knew all about them, when in fact we didn't. So I like the fact that, I told you this textbook is very uneven. I really don't like chapter 1 at all, but I really like the coverage of chapter 2, even though I think it's underdeveloped. But I've got to remind myself that this course is like a buffet. There is a lot there. There's no way you can digest it all. So you take a little bit of a variety of items, and that's what we're going to do here. And in lecture, I'll try to expand upon them. Now, before the Ionians, the ancient Greek world placed an emphasis on mythology to understand the universe. And when I was in high school, one of the most interesting courses that I took in high school was a course in mythology, and we studied Greek mythology, we studied Norse mythology, we studied Roman mythology and gods. But to me, the most interesting were the Greeks and the Norse, the Scandinavian uh, mythology. The Ionians do not find mythology to be an adequate explanation for their world. And so the reason that most political textbooks don't talk about the Ionians is that the Ionians are not interested in political behavior. They're not interested in human behavior. Instead, what the Ionians are interested in is the universe and the world that they inhabit. But what makes them so important as a prerequisite to ancient Greek political philosophy is that the Ionians introduced this notion of rationality to the discussion. The Ionians invent philosophy, natural philosophy that today we call science. So the Ionians, in trying to understand their world, they debated the form, the substance of our universe with very, very different hypotheses. What was the ultimate material that makes up our world? Was it air? Was it water? Was it fire? Was it some other substance? Or was it a combination of substances? And they come up with a lot of hypotheses. And certainly there is a word that we talked about in chapter 1, right? In this case, it is a guess trying to link phenomenon together. So you add phenomenon like water and a cold temperature, and the result is that water changes from a liquid water to a solid ice. Or if you heat it up enough, maybe it turns into a gassy substance. We might call that steam, for example. So the Ionians believe that there were laws that explained natural behavior. And by natural behavior, these would be things like a solar eclipse or an earthquake, for example. So, Ionia is a collection of islands in the Aegean Sea. They're between Greece and Turkey. There is an actual island of Ionia. You will notice at the top of your page that there is a little map of the island. And most of the earliest thinkers came from the very southern part of that island in Miletus, which was a cultural center. It was an educational center. And as I have in the notes, was kind of a cultural crossroads. So the people of Miletus knew the various religions and superstitions of people like the Persians and the Egyptians and the Assyrians in a whole variety of areas. And it is the Ionian philosophy that gets transplanted to ancient Athens, which is going to be the focus of this chapter. And what the Athenians are going to do is they are going to use this rationality to explain human behavior and human motivation. And their focus is going to be on people and not the world that they happen to inhabit. So, as your notes point out, the Ionians are important because they discovered what it means to think in terms of rationality. They tried to ask rational questions. Now, don't misinterpret that. That certainly did not mean that those questions and answers were correct. For example, Thales, who I'll talk about earlier, trying to explain earthquakes, believed that the earth was floating on a vast sea of water and that earthquakes occurred when waves hit the earth and, of course, shook it, and that created an earthquake. Now, that isn't what creates earthquakes, but notice the emphasis is on asking the question, what causes earthquakes? And the answer was not because one of the gods gets angry and takes his wrath out on the earth, but instead that there is some natural phenomenon. Now, in this case, waves of water. In reality, the answer uh, is different from that, but the answer is natural. So they concluded that the world was a cosmos. It was a space that was orderly, that it was organized. And Aristotle himself, who is my favorite of the three ancient Greeks, when we talk about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, I believe you'll notice that there's a little bit more energy and enthusiasm in my voice when I talk about Aristotle, because I think Aristotle's emphasis is that of the three great ancient Greek scholars that we're going to focus our attention on, his emphasis isn't on creating the perfect society or what would create the perfect society. Aristotle believes in the here and now and the practical world and what is the best world that we can practically create. So I believe he's a lot more practical than the other theorists. But Aristotle himself called the Ionians those who discourse on nature. And Aristotle also was a believer in the natural world. In fact, if I remember the story correctly, and I may have it in my notes, Aristotle on his honeymoon went out and collected biological specimens. So certainly Aristotle saw himself as a scientist, much as the Ionians did. I listed general features of the Ionian philosophy in your notes. I probably won't test you specifically on it, but I thought it was intriguing and I thought it was certainly a nice addition to your notes. But you will notice as I go through the discussion, probably in the next mini lecture, that the Ionians debated, but they all tended to believe that there was a ruling element, that ultimately the world was made of stuff and they debated about what the ultimate stuff was. So was it earth? Was it air? Was it fire? Was it water? Um, which is the main substance of everything. And what is, of course, interesting for those of you who have taken physics, for example, is the Ionians believed that substances are not created or destroyed, they are converted. So this notion that a substance isn't destroyed, it is merely converted into something else, is pretty sophisticated thinking for 2,600 years ago. The Ionians were also preoccupied with changes in nature. The fact that, for example, objects seem to have a birth, a lifespan, and a death. Obviously, for some creatures, birth and death may be only days apart. But in some cases, if we're talking about some trees, for example, it might be thousands of years apart. That there was a cyclical change between day and night and back to day, or the four seasons, a spring, a summer, a fall, a winter. And of course, these natural cyclical changes could be observed as being repeatable. They weren't one time things. There isn't a day, a night, and then it stops. There's a new day, a new night, a new day, a new night. And of course, yearly, there are the seasons. And obviously, seeing these cyclical changes in nature, how do you explain those? What is the hypotheses? How and why do seasons change? And of course, in mythology, those changes all had spiritual connotations connected to the gods. And the Ionians say that that's not true, that those cyclical changes in nature occur because of natural phenomenon and natural occurrences, and they are not inspired because of some divine intervention. And of course, the Ionians also ascribe mind and intelligence to at least one and usually all of the elements. Uh, the next thing that I point out are four terms. And once again, uh, this is a bit repetitive, but I think it just puts a little bit of meat on the bone. The Ionians were naturalist or naturalism, the view that the world around them has no explanation or little to the supernatural. So Thales, who I'm going to mention in a future mini lecture, he actually predicted an eclipse of the sun. When the armies heard about this and he predicted exactly the day that it would occur, they were absolutely stunned. They actually ran off the battlefield. They were so afraid at what had happened. He predicted a bumper crop of olives, for example. And the point was, with naturalism, once again, it is a reaffirmation that natural events have natural explanations. They're not a result of the anger or the blessings of the gods in any way. The second is materialism, that everything's made out of material in various combinations, and once again, rejecting spiritual realms. Monism, the view that there is one basic kind of stuff from which all things are made. And later we get people like Democritus, who we call the atomists, right? That stuff are really atoms. But earlier philosophers, not as precise and incorrect, right? Thales saying it's water, Anamixmes, everything out of air. They weren't correct on that. The atomists turn out to be correct when we talk about atoms being the building block of the universe. But certainly the atom is built on this early natural philosophy. And the last one that I want to mention is hylozoism, the view that all matter is alive, and the notion that when material change occurs in the world, it's kind of explained in terms of the life of the item. So, for example, a year has a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winner. And so that is the life of a year. When we come back, I'll continue by talking about your textbook's emphasis on the theory of becoming and being.